The story opens not with a thunderous battle or a golden crown, but with the simple cry of a newborn boy in the bustling city of Rome. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar. At first glance, nothing seemed too extraordinary. Rome had plenty of noble babies. But history was about to prove this child very different. The Republic at the time was a boiling pot of corruption, power struggles, and senators who argued more than an entire amphitheater of lawyers. Into this chaos, Caesar was born into the Julius family, respectable, old, and noble, but not the most powerful. Yet in the eyes of his mother Aurelia, a sharp and determined woman, Caesar was destined for more. If Rome was a stage, young Caesar was preparing to steal the spotlight. This opening moment sets the tone for our journey, not just the life of a man, but the legend of a figure who would rise from a vulnerable child to one of the most unforgettable names in world history. To truly understand Caesar's beginnings, we must first peek into the chaos of the Roman Republic. Imagine a political system where senators shouted louder than street vendors, corruption flowed faster than the Tiber River, and every other week someone was plotting to be the next big thing. Rome wasn't exactly the model of stability. It was more like a family dinner where everyone brought knives instead of dessert. The aristocrats, or optimates, clung tightly to their privileges, while the populars rallied the common people, promising bread, circuses, and occasionally some justice. Add to that constant wars abroad, economic inequality, and gladiators entertaining the masses with blood sport, and you have a city that was equal parts magnificent and madhouse. Into this setting, baby Caesar was destined to grow up. For him, the streets of Rome weren't just cobblestones. They were a training ground in power, persuasion, and surviving the kind of politics that made a lion's den look like a nursery. Amid this circus of chaos stood the Julius family, Caesar's clan. They were like that old aristocratic family everyone respected, but nobody invited to the VIP lounge. The Julius claimed divine descent from Venus herself, a family tree that reached all the way to the heavens. But in real Roman politics, their influence was more like a polite cough than a roaring speech. They had the noble name, yes, but not the fat purse or legions of loyal followers to match. Think of them as the ancient version of a blue-check family, verified but not trending. Still, in a city where prestige mattered as much as swords, the Julius name gave young Caesar a starting ticket to the big leagues. It wasn't enough to win him power outright, but it was just enough to open doors, shake hands, and later, shove rivals out of the way. While the Republic wobbled like a drunken gladiator, Caesar's family background quietly sharpened the blade that he himself would one day swing against Rome's fate. For young Caesar, childhood wasn't just about playing with wooden swords or chasing pigeons in the Forum. His early years were an intense crash course in the arts that would later make him dangerous: rhetoric, law, and military science. Picture a boy barely tall enough to reach the podium, practicing fiery speeches in front of amused tutors who probably thought, "This kid is rehearsing to sue the gods someday." At home, he devoured lessons in literature and philosophy, while outside he observed the sharp tongues of senators and the sharper blades of soldiers. His training wasn't simply about memorizing laws or swinging a sword. It was about understanding how to bend people's minds and, when needed, their spines. Every day in Rome was a free class. The Senate provided lectures in hypocrisy, the courts offered workshops in drama, and the streets taught survival skills better than any academy. Caesar wasn't just learning, he was sharpening his weapons, one word, one law, and one sword stroke at a time. Behind every great man stands someone who makes sure he eats his vegetables, learns his lessons, and doesn't get himself killed before adulthood. For Caesar, that person was his mother, Aurelia. She wasn't just a typical Roman matron, quietly weaving at home. Oh no, Aurelia was more like the CEO of the household, with a razor-sharp mind and an iron will hidden under elegant robes. When senators quarreled in public squares, Aurelia taught her son how to read their faces like open scrolls. When tutors drilled him in grammar and philosophy, she added her own lessons in discipline and ambition. Her stern gaze alone could silence a rowdy classroom or a cheeky young Caesar. In a city where fathers often busied themselves with politics or war, Aurelia became the guiding hand shaping Caesar's mind. She instilled resilience, cunning, and a sense that destiny was something you grabbed with both hands. Without Aurelia, young Julius might have been just another name in the census. With her, he became the boy who would dream of ruling Rome itself. While other Roman boys were content with practicing slingshots or dreaming of becoming gladiators, young Caesar's imagination was already galloping far ahead. He wasn't the type to just sit and watch politics like theater. He wanted to rewrite the script and star as the lead. His classmates might have bragged about winning a marble game, but Caesar boasted about how one day he would bend senators to his will. Even at a young age, he had that unmistakable sparkle in his eyes, the kind that said, "Why settle for being just another noble when you can be the name etched into history?" His ambition wasn't loud arrogance, but a quiet, relentless drive. He studied harder, spoke bolder, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that made adults mutter, "This boy is dangerous." Rome was full of children of noble families, but Caesar wasn't content to blend in. He wanted to rise, to lead, and, most importantly, to win. And while no one else saw it clearly yet, the boy already felt destiny tapping him on the shoulder. Just when young Caesar was finding his rhythm, reciting speeches like a mini Cicero, and strutting around Rome with more confidence than his allowance could justify, history decided to throw him into a gladiator pit of politics. Enter Sulla, the ruthless dictator of Rome, a man who thought democracy was best enjoyed in small doses. Like none at all. Sulla began purging his enemies with a hit list that made Rome's streets feel like the world's most dangerous lottery. And guess what? Caesar's name ended up on that very list, courtesy of his inconvenient family connections and refusal to play nice. For a teenager, this wasn't your average grounding. It was a survival trial where the stakes were life or death. To make it worse, Sulla reportedly quipped that in Caesar he saw many Mariuses, a poetic way of saying, "This boy is trouble." Faced with exile, hiding, or worse, young Caesar's mettle was tested early. Rome wasn't going to hand him greatness. It was going to chase him with knives first. With Sulla's death list hot on his trail, young Caesar suddenly found himself living the life of an action hero, minus the glamorous soundtrack. One day he was strolling through Rome, the next he was ducking behind walls, slipping through alleys, and bribing guards just to keep breathing. Imagine being a teenager whose biggest worry should have been acne, but instead it was avoiding professional assassins. Caesar learned early the fine art of disappearing. He disguised himself, relied on distant relatives, and at times fled into the countryside like a fugitive in sandals. Rome, with all its marble and power, was no longer home. It was a hunting ground, and he was the prey. Yet in this dangerous game of hide and seek, Caesar didn't break. If anything, the constant threat sharpened him like steel and fire. Every narrow escape whispered the same lesson. Survival isn't luck, it's strategy. And little by little, Caesar began to transform from a privileged boy into a survivor who would one day return, not as prey, but as the hunter. Every brush with danger left young Caesar tougher than before, like iron tempered in fire. Hiding from Sulla's assassins had not broken him. Instead, it carved out a resilience that became the foundation of his destiny. He learned to trust his wits more than swords, to adapt quickly when fortune shifted, and to stand tall even when the world tried to push him down. At times, he was penniless, stripped of comfort, wandering as a fugitive. Yet each hardship became a secret training ground, teaching him patience, discipline, and the art of playing the long game. Rome might not have noticed the boy slipping through its alleys, but he was already shaping into someone who wouldn't just survive history, he'd dominate it. Where others saw setbacks, Caesar saw rehearsal. Where others broke under pressure, he forged ambition into steel. The young noble who had once been prey was transforming into a predator of politics, quietly preparing for the moment Rome would finally hear his name echo across the forum. And so, the first chapter of Caesar's story closes not with a triumphal march or glittering laurel crown, but with a question hanging in the air like suspense in a Roman courtroom. How could a nearly unknown boy, chased from his city and stripped of comfort, one day rise to become the name on everyone's lips? His early life was less about glory and more about survival, shaped by the strict guidance of his mother, the chaos of Roman politics, and the constant reminder that ambition without resilience is just daydreaming. Caesar had already proven he could outwit soldiers, dodge assassins, and sharpen his mind while the Republic itself stumbled like a drunk gladiator. The stage was set, the world was unpredictable, and the boy who once seemed insignificant had already started writing his own script. Rome didn't know it yet, but the future was quietly practicing in the shadows. And the question for us, dear audience, is this: when destiny comes knocking, will Caesar answer like a frightened child, or like the man who will one day rule them all? After surviving assassins and exile, Caesar realized that hiding in alleys wasn't going to make him famous. So he turned to the Roman army, where ambition could march on two legs and carry a sword. The young noble joined the legions, trading the comfort of marble villas for muddy boots and endless drills. This wasn't summer camp. It was Rome's most brutal gym membership. Caesar quickly proved he wasn't just another spoiled aristocrat. He endured long marches, fought skirmishes, and, more importantly, showed he could lead men who didn't care about family trees, but respected courage. Battlefields became his classroom. He learned discipline, strategy, and how to shout commands loud enough to be heard over clashing swords. Each scar, each campaign, was a line on his resume that said, "Not just politics, this guy can fight." In a republic that admired both brains and brawn, Caesar was carefully sculpting the image of a leader who could do it all. And while the Senate squabbled back home, Caesar was sharpening both his sword and his destiny. Fresh from proving himself in the army, Caesar soon stumbled into an adventure that sounded more like a comedy script than a military resume. He was kidnapped by Cilician pirates. Yes, the future conqueror of Gaul and dictator of Rome was once tied up on a pirate ship, surrounded by men who thought they caught easy ransom money. But Caesar wasn't the type to play victim. Instead of cowering, he treated the pirates like his personal audience. He joked with them, demanded they raise his ransom higher because he was worth more, and even joined their games as if it were a seaside vacation. The pirates laughed, but little did they know the punchline was coming. Caesar swore that once freed, he would come back to crucify them. And he wasn't kidding. When the ransom was paid and he was released, he immediately raised a fleet, hunted them down, and kept his word. The episode didn't just prove Caesar's boldness, it showed that even in chains, he carried himself like a man already destined to command. After surviving pirates and proving his bravado, Caesar decided it was time to swap swords for words. Enter the Forum, the beating heart of Roman politics, gossip, and endless debates. Picture young Caesar, cloak neatly draped, stepping up to the rostrum with all the confidence of a man who once told kidnappers to raise his ransom. His voice wasn't just loud, it was sharp, rhythmic, and full of fire. He attacked corruption, defended allies, and sprinkled just enough wit to make the crowd roar with laughter before silencing them with gravity. People began to whisper, "This boy speaks like Cicero, but with swagger." Unlike many aristocrats, he didn't drone on in dry legal jargon. His speeches were theater, part law, part comedy show, part rallying cry. Every word was a weapon, and every cheer from the crowd was proof he was winning battles without drawing a blade. In Rome, rhetoric was as deadly as steel, and Caesar was proving he could duel with his tongue as fiercely as any general with a gladius. Having wowed the crowd with speeches, Caesar realized applause didn't pay the bills, or buy influence. To truly climb in Rome, he needed titles, even the small ones that made seasoned senators yawn. So he began his political journey by taking on minor offices, the kind of roles most nobles treated like internships, glamorous in name, tedious in practice. But Caesar didn't just shuffle papers, he turned every post into a stage. As quaestor, he managed finances with flair. As aedile, he organized games and public works that made citizens cheer louder than gladiators. He spent money he didn't have, throwing festivals so lavish people joked he was trying to bankrupt himself into popularity. Spoiler, it worked. Caesar's strategy was clear: use even the smallest offices to charm the public and remind Rome that politics wasn't just about law and taxes, but about winning hearts. While others slogged through bureaucracy, Caesar made it entertainment, building a fan base one spectacle at a time. After dazzling Rome with games and festivals, Caesar knew he needed more than applause. He needed a reputation as a man of the people. While many senators were busy counting coins and sipping wine, Caesar was out in the streets shaking hands, listening to complaints, and promising reforms. He championed debt relief, land distribution, and rights for the poor, sounding less like a patrician and more like a politician who actually cared. Of course, his fellow aristocrats rolled their eyes, muttering that he was just buying votes with smiles and spectacles. But Caesar understood something vital. The crowd was the real power in Rome, and if you won them over, the Senate would eventually have to follow. He carefully crafted the image of a reformer, young, charismatic, daring to challenge tradition. Every speech, every gesture, painted him as the champion of ordinary Romans. Slowly, the idea took root. Caesar wasn't just another ambitious noble. He was the people's man, and that made him very dangerous to the old guard. Caesar knew that in Rome, politics wasn't just about speeches and reforms. It was about alliances, the kind you sealed not only with handshakes but with dinners, marriages, and occasionally shared enemies. While his rivals relied on their ancient family names, Caesar built bridges like a master architect of human ambition. He charmed powerful senators with his wit, impressed generals with his courage, and made sure the wealthiest equestrians felt important at his banquets. To the common people, he was the friendly reformer. To the elites, he was the useful ally. His network began to resemble a spider's web, intricate, delicate, yet strong enough to trap opportunities. Every smile, every toast, every whispered word at a party wasn't just small talk. It was political currency, and Caesar spent it generously, knowing the investment would pay off when votes, troops, or favors were needed. The result: by the time most senators realized it, Caesar had woven himself into the fabric of Roman politics so tightly that pulling him out would risk unraveling the whole tapestry. Caesar's first big splash in the courts was less about dry legal codes and more about turning trials into theater. With his booming voice and sharp wit, he didn't just argue cases, he performed them, complete with dramatic pauses and eyebrow raises that could silence a crowd. To the jury, he was a lawyer. To the spectators, he was practically stand-up comedy in a toga. One opponent expected a dull debate about property law, only to be verbally body-slammed with rhetoric so clever the crowd burst into applause. Caesar knew the courtroom wasn't just about justice. It was a stage where reputations were built and enemies embarrassed. He sharpened his arguments like a gladius, turning each cross-examination into a duel. The more victories he scored, the more the Roman public whispered his name with admiration, and the more senators muttered it with annoyance. These legal battles were his rehearsal for the grand drama of politics, and Caesar played his role with flair, half lawyer, half actor, and entirely unforgettable. Unlike the stiff politicians who strutted around Rome with noses higher than their togas, Caesar knew the secret recipe for popularity: being human. Instead of hiding behind marble columns, he strolled through markets, chatted with bakers about bread prices, and even cracked jokes with farmers about the stubbornness of donkeys. While other senators perfected their serious statesman frown, Caesar perfected the art of the approachable grin. Crowds followed him not because he promised miracles, but because he actually listened, sometimes even remembering names, which in Rome was practically sorcery. Children tugged at his toga, merchants offered him fruit, and veterans clapped him on the back as if he were an old friend. To the aristocracy, this looked dangerously informal. To the common people, it looked like love. Caesar's ability to blur the line between politician and neighbor turned him into a celebrity of the streets. And soon the forum echoed with whispers. Here was a leader who felt less like marble statue and more like flesh and blood. Of course, the brighter Caesar's star shone among the people, the darker the glares he received from the Senate benches. For every farmer who cheered his name, there was an aristocrat grinding his teeth hard enough to chip marble. His casual strolls through the marketplace and witty speeches made him a hero of the streets. But in the eyes of Rome's elite, he was a dangerous upstart daring to rewrite the rules of the game. Whispers turned into mutterings, mutterings into plots. Rivals painted him as a reckless populist, a man willing to risk the republic just for applause. Some mocked his purple-trimmed toga as if he were already dressing for a throne. Suddenly, banquets became breeding grounds for insults disguised as jokes, and forums echoed with veiled warnings. Caesar, of course, met hostility with a trademark smirk and a sharper retort, but the daggers in people's words hinted at daggers that might one day be drawn for real. The political theater of Rome had found its newest drama, Caesar versus the Senate. By now, Caesar had danced his way through the battlefield, the forum, and even a pirate hostage situation. Talk about a resume. What started as a young officer eager to prove himself had evolved into a rising political star who could charm the sandals off the common folk and still outwit senators with twice his wrinkles. The people adored his easy wit and his knack for talking like he was one of them, not some marble statue perched in the Senate. Meanwhile, his enemies grumbled, but even they had to admit, this upstart wasn't just passing through, he was building a permanent tent in Rome's political circus. Caesar had carved out his first real foothold on the grand stage, standing firm in the middle of applause and daggers alike. He wasn't yet the master of Rome, but the opening act had gone splendidly. And if the first steps already shook the Republic, imagine what would happen when he started running. If Caesar was the rising star of Roman politics, then here come the two big players already shining on the stage. First up, Pompey the Great, Rome's superstar general, famous for conquering more lands than most people could even name. He strutted around like the Republic's golden boy, the type who'd enter a room and expect the marble floors to applaud. Then there was Crassus, the richest man in Rome, so wealthy he could probably buy the Senate's loyalty with spare change. His fortune came from real estate, silver mines, and a not-so-subtle side hustle of lending money at interest rates that made people's eyebrows permanently raised. Together, these two were already powerful enough, but each had weaknesses. Pompey wanted legitimacy, Crassus wanted respect, and both wanted more power than the Senate was willing to give. Enter Caesar, the ambitious newcomer with a knack for connecting dots and people. Like any good story, before the alliance is formed, the cast must be introduced. And in this act, Rome's stage just got two heavyweights ready to rumble. Rome's political stage was a battlefield without swords, but with daggers hidden in every smile. The Senate, dominated by the aristocratic elite, treated Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus like upstart gladiators who didn't deserve front-row seats. The nobles clung to their privileges with the grip of a miser holding on to his last coin. Pompey wanted recognition for his military conquests, but the Senate preferred to downplay his glory. Crassus, despite swimming in money, was constantly mocked for buying influence instead of earning it. And Caesar? He was charming the masses, which terrified the senators more than a barbarian army at the gates. Each man had hit a wall. Alone, they couldn't break through the fortress of privilege. But together, they could knock down the Senate's smug walls like a wrecking ball in a toga. It wasn't about friendship, it was about survival and ambition. The reason for their alliance was simple. When the old guard won't open the door, you kick it down, preferably with 3 pairs of sandals instead of 1. If Pompey was the muscle and Crassus the money, Caesar was clearly the glue, and not the cheap kind, but the kind that holds together an empire. He had the charm to make Pompey feel respected, the wit to stop Crassus from sulking, and the boldness to tell the Senate, "No, you can't sit with us." While Pompey and Crassus often clashed like 2 stubborn rams, Caesar slipped in as the diplomat, balancing egos with a smile and a clever word. He listened to Pompey's grand military stories without yawning, and he nodded at Crassus's endless bragging about gold without rolling his eyes. Skills that made him the unofficial therapist of the alliance. More than that, Caesar knew how to connect with the people and bring their support to the table, giving the triumvirate not just raw power, but popular legitimacy. Without him, Pompey and Crassus would have been like oil and water. With him, they were more like oil, water, and a very persuasive bartender mixing the cocktail. In politics, alliances often need more than handshakes. They need family ties. Caesar, master of strategy both on the battlefield and in the drawing room, pulled off one of Rome's boldest power moves. He married his beloved daughter Julia to Pompey. On paper, it was a love story blessed by the gods. In reality, it was a calculated chess move. Julia was young, graceful, and adored by the Roman crowd, while Pompey was the decorated war hero in need of a fresh PR boost. Together, they looked like a dream couple, but everyone knew Caesar was the one writing the script. Senators whispered that Cupid had just been hired as Caesar's campaign manager. The marriage tied Pompey closer to Caesar, smoothing over rivalries with the warmth of family dinners and shared wine. Of course, Crassus wasn't thrilled. Being left out of the in-law circle meant fewer feasts and no free wedding cake. Still, this political romance cemented the triumvirate even tighter. It was less about love and more about loyalty, proving once again that in Rome, the altar could be just as powerful as the Senate floor. With Julia's wedding bells still echoing in the air, the triumvirate quickly turned from a marriage celebration into a political takeover. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, three men with egos big enough to block the Tiber, suddenly found themselves pulling the strings of Rome like a trio of very smug puppeteers. The Senate, once the mighty voice of the Republic, now looked more like a chorus forced to sing backup. Laws passed faster, favors were handed out like free bread at the circus, and public opinion shifted in their favor. Pompey paraded his military glory, Crassus flexed his overflowing coffers, and Caesar used his charisma like it was an unlimited credit card. Together, they turned Roman politics into their private stage, each move carefully choreographed to tighten their grip. To outsiders, it looked like harmony. Inside, it was more like three lions trying to share the same throne. But for now, the alliance worked like a well-oiled war machine, leaving the Senate grumbling in the shadows. Rome wasn't just under new management, it was under a three-headed one, and each head wanted to roar louder than the other. The Senate, grinding its teeth but forced to play along, finally handed Caesar the glittering prize, the consulship. For Rome, this meant he wasn't just whispering in the corridors anymore. He had the keys to the front door. Caesar accepted with a smile that was equal parts charm and mischief, the kind of grin that said, "Brace yourselves, reforms are coming." The senators, meanwhile, looked like wedding guests realizing the cake has been stolen by the groom. With this new title, Caesar could officially put his stamp on laws, chair debates, and, most dangerously, bypass a lot of the old guard's grumbling. Pompey and Crassus cheered from the sidelines, seeing their allies rise as a win for the whole triumvirate. The common people, who adored Caesar's speeches and generosity, celebrated like it was a second Saturnalia. For the aristocrats, however, the consulship wasn't a title. It was a storm warning. Caesar wasn't content being a piece on the board anymore. He had become the player moving the pieces, and Rome was about to find out what kind of game he intended to play. Once seated as consul, Caesar wasted no time shaking the dust off Rome's cobweb politics. His reforms came like a whirlwind, distributing land to veterans and the poor, curbing corruption among tax collectors, and pushing through laws with the speed of a chariot race. The Senate groaned as if Caesar had replaced their fine wine with vinegar, but the common people adored it. To them, he was the rare politician who not only promised bread, but actually delivered it. Even Pompey and Crassus, usually eager to hog the spotlight, found themselves clapping in the background, impressed by Caesar's political acrobatics. These reforms boosted Caesar's popularity to dazzling heights, transforming him from an ambitious statesman into a true people's champion. Of course, the nobility saw it differently. Each decree felt like Caesar was chiseling away at their privileges, one marble block at a time. The Senate's patience wore thinner than a toga in the rain. Still, Caesar strutted through the forum with that signature grin, knowing every new law carved his name deeper into Rome's story. For him, reform wasn't just policy, it was performance, and the crowd was cheering louder than ever. The Senate, once content to grumble in whispers, now boiled like a pot left too long on the fire. Caesar's reforms may have thrilled the masses, but to the aristocrats, they felt like daggers aimed at their wallets and pride. Each new law stripped a little more shine from their golden privileges. In the Curia, senators muttered, rolled their eyes, and sighed dramatically, as if enduring Caesar was a personal tragedy worthy of Greek theater. Some plotted quietly, Others loudly stomped their sandals in protest, but all agreed. Caesar was getting too big for his laurel wreath. While Caesar paraded through Rome like a rock star politician, the Senate huddled in shadowed corners, sharpening their complaints into weapons. They accused him of undermining tradition, of playing to the mob, of caring more about applause than precedent. And though they were right about the applause part, the people loved him for it. The tension was undeniable. Rome felt like a stage where one actor hogged the spotlight while the rest hissed from backstage. The Senate's discontent wasn't just irritation anymore. It was the early rumble of a storm waiting to break. While Caesar danced in the spotlight, Pompey and Crassus were busy counting their winnings in the shadows. Pompey basked in the glow of new honors and military commands, his chest puffed out like a rooster at dawn. Crassus, never one to be left behind, jingled his coins with glee, using Caesar's reforms as a ladder to fatten his already bulging fortune. Outwardly, they were still Caesar's partners in glory, smiling together like a perfectly rehearsed trio. But behind those polished grins, the cracks were widening. Pompey grew uneasy with Caesar's growing fan club. The people adored him a little too much for Pompey's liking. Crassus, meanwhile, felt overshadowed by both men, like the awkward third wheel at a dinner party. The alliance was supposed to be a pact of equals, but it was starting to feel more like a tug of war over who could pull Rome hardest in their direction. They still toasted each other at banquets, yet every clink of the wine cups carried a silent question. How long before we stop drinking together and start fighting instead? The tension simmered quietly, but everyone could feel that sooner or later, the pot would boil over. The first triumvirate, though stitched together with ambition and wine toasts, became the rocket launcher for Caesar's career. With Pompey flaunting his military might and Crassus jingling his wealth, Caesar stood in the middle like a conductor orchestrating a very unstable symphony. The Senate fumed, but the people cheered. Finally, someone who made politics entertaining. For now, the alliance worked. Pompey enjoyed prestige, Crassus expanded his fortune, and Caesar carved his name into the political granite of Rome. Yet beneath the marble smiles and celebratory banquets, fault lines were already visible. Pompey's pride, Crassus's envy, and Caesar's rising star were three ingredients in a recipe that could only end in fireworks. Still, for Caesar, this was the launch pad. He had leveraged friendships, family ties, and reforms into something greater, a path that pointed beyond Rome itself, toward glory in Gaul, and ultimately the destiny of empire. The chapter closes with the triumvirate looking strong, but anyone watching closely could see the cracks beginning to snake through the foundation. Caesar, however, marched forward with the confidence of a man who knew the show had only just begun. After conquering the political circus of Rome, Caesar now received his next big gig, command of the Roman legions in Gaul. To many senators, it felt like they were shipping him off to the wilderness with barbarians and mud, hardly the glamorous stage of Roman politics. But Caesar, ever the opportunist, saw Gaul as a blank canvas, ready for him to paint in bold, bloody strokes. With legions at his back and ambition bursting out of his toga, he prepared to turn the frontier into his personal arena. Soldiers admired his charisma, creditors prayed he wouldn't bankrupt them further, and the Senate secretly hoped he'd get lost in the forest. Instead, Caesar took one look at Gaul's patchwork of tribes and thought, perfect, an all-you-can-conquer buffet. The assignment wasn't just military, it was destiny's invitation. For Caesar, this was no exile. It was the ultimate upgrade, from Rome's squabbling politics to a stage big enough for legend. The curtain rose, the legions marched, and Gaul had no idea what kind of storm was about to move in, wrapped in sandals and ambition. No sooner had Caesar unpacked his sandals in Gaul than trouble came knocking, or rather charging, with the first tribal uprisings. The Helvetii, a restless group of wanderers, thought it would be fun to migrate through Roman territory as if Caesar's provinces were some kind of scenic hiking trail. Caesar, never a fan of uninvited guests, decided to turn this into his debut performance as Gaul's new sheriff. His legions moved with discipline, shields gleaming, while tribal warriors roared with hair flying like heavy metal rock stars. The clash was thunderous, But Caesar's strategy was sharper than any Gallic axe. He cut supply lines, set clever ambushes, and turned the battle into a masterclass of Roman precision versus wild chaos. For the soldiers, it was exhilarating. For the Helvetii, less so. They learned that marching into Roman turf was like poking a lion with a stick. The victory wasn't just a win on the battlefield. It was Caesar planting his flag, declaring that Rome, and Caesar himself, was here to stay. The first campaign ended with applause from the legions and groans from his enemies, setting the stage for many more spectacular encounters. Fresh from his first triumph, Caesar wasted no time turning Gaul into his personal chessboard, and he played like a grandmaster with an unlimited supply of pawns. Each tribe that dared to stand up found themselves facing a Roman war machine that moved with the precision of clockwork. Caesar wasn't just swinging swords. He was orchestrating strategies with the flair of a stage director, making sure every battle ended with Rome's name in lights. Whether it was outmaneuvering cavalry in open fields or laying sieges with engineering that looked suspiciously like overcomplicated IKEA projects, Caesar made victory feel inevitable. His soldiers, once skeptical, now marched with swagger, convinced their general could probably conquer the moon if it had farmland. For the Gauls, however, this was a nightmare on repeat. Rally, resist, get crushed, repeat. Caesar's reputation grew with each success, and back in Rome, whispers turned into cheers, though also some envious frowns. In Gaul, he wasn't just winning battles, he was composing a symphony of victories, and every note was another step toward his unstoppable rise. Caesar knew that victories on the battlefield were impressive, but victories on parchment could echo for centuries. So he picked up the pen, or rather dictated furiously to scribes, and produced the Commentari de Bello Gallico. This wasn't just a war report, it was Caesar's personal highlight reel, written with the flair of a best-selling novelist and the modesty of someone who describes themselves as humble yet brilliant. Every chapter painted him as the fearless commander, the wise strategist, and the inevitable hero of Rome. Skirmishes became epic showdowns, tactical maneuvers turned into legendary masterstrokes, and Caesar's occasional close calls were rebranded as moments of divine testing. The Roman public devoured it, senators grit their teeth, and even Caesar's rivals found themselves flipping pages just to see how they were humiliated in print. In truth, Commentarii was less a diary and more an ancient PR campaign that made Caesar not just a general, but a brand. By the time the ink dried, his fame had marched farther than his legions, straight into every forum, household, and tavern of Rome. As Caesar's legions marched deeper into Gaul, they found themselves in the kind of terrain that would make even goats reconsider their life choices. Towering mountains, tangled forests, and valleys so narrow you had to breathe in just to squeeze through. Local tribes thought these landscapes would be their secret weapon. After all, Romans in shiny armor weren't exactly built for cliff climbing or bushwhacking, but Caesar wasn't about to let geography outsmart him. With a mix of stubbornness and engineering genius, he had his men cutting roads through forests, building fortifications on ridges, and even dragging siege engines where only deer had dared to tread. The tribes tried ambushes from behind trees, surprise attacks from rocky ledges, and even rolling boulders downhill. The result? Caesar's men turned every trap into a rehearsal for the next victory. By the end, the tribes realized their wilderness wasn't a fortress. It was Caesar's playground. The Romans didn't just conquer the people, they tamed the very land itself, proving that if nature tried to block them, they'd simply remodel it into a Roman highway. After wrestling mountains and outsmarting forests, Caesar's appetite for conquest grew even hungrier. Like a man who starts with one slice of pizza and ends up finishing the whole box. He didn't just want Gaul, he wanted the horizon itself. Step by step, campaign by campaign, his legions pressed westward, driving the Roman eagle closer and closer to the Atlantic Ocean. For the Gauls, this was unthinkable, the end of the world, where the sun sank into the sea. For Caesar, it was Tuesday. Villages fell in line, tribes surrendered, and roads stretched further than a marathon runner's patience. Each victory was another brushstroke on a massive Roman map, red lines sweeping across territories once thought unreachable. And when at last Caesar's troops stood at the edge of the Atlantic, staring at the waves crashing dramatically against the cliffs, the general didn't look like a man at the end of the earth. He looked like one already imagining his next move. The message was clear. No land was too far, no sea too wide, and certainly no tribe too wild for Rome's new rising star. After reaching the Atlantic, Caesar looked east again. Because why stop when you can flex twice? The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine were like the mysterious neighbors across the fence, loud, unpredictable, and rumored to throw really wild parties. Instead of ignoring them, Caesar decided to make a statement. He built a bridge, not a cute little wooden one, but a massive engineering marvel of logs, beams, and sheer Roman stubbornness. Within days, his soldiers marched across the Rhine, helmets glinting, shields raised, as if casually dropping by to say, "Hi, just checking in on the neighborhood." The tribes were stunned. No one had expected the Romans to literally build a highway across a roaring river just to prove they could. And Caesar? He didn't even stay long, just enough to scare the living daylights out of everyone, then dismantle the bridge like a mic drop. Oh, and he did it again a second time, because once is impressive, but twice? That's how legends are made. These crossings were less about territory and more about reputation. Caesar wanted the world to know rivers weren't barriers. They were stages for Rome's power show. After casually building bridges over the Rhine, Caesar turned his gaze across the channel to the mysterious island of Britannia. To the Romans, it was a foggy land of painted warriors, strange gods, and frankly, too much rain. But to Caesar, it was the perfect stage for his next power move. So he ordered ships, loaded his legions, and sailed off like the world's most ambitious tourist. The landing was anything but smooth. Stormy seas rocked the boats, the tides were tricky, and the Britons were waiting on the beaches, painted blue and yelling like they'd invented heavy metal. Yet Caesar pressed on, sending his troops ashore with shields raised, forming battle lines right in the surf. The clash was chaotic, waves, javelins, and chariots darting around. But Rome carved a foothold. Though the campaign wasn't a full conquest, the mere fact that Caesar reached the edge of the known world was enough to dazzle Rome. Back home, people whispered, "He even crossed the ocean." In truth, Caesar didn't get much from Britannia except mud, resistance, and stories of druids. But the propaganda, priceless. And then came Alesia, the grand finale of Caesar's Gaulish adventure. Vercingetorix, the charismatic Gallic leader with hair that could rival any rock star, rallied tens of thousands of warriors to stand against Rome. It was supposed to be Gaul's last glorious stand, but Caesar, instead of charging head-on, decided to play ancient Sim City. He built not one, but two giant rings of fortifications, one facing inward to trap Vercingetorix, and another facing outward to fend off the inevitable Gallic reinforcements. Imagine a fortress wearing a fortress as armor. The siege dragged on with starvation, desperate sorties, and more than a few, "Whose idea was this?" moments inside Alesia. Finally, when relief forces arrived, the battlefield turned into pure chaos. Cavalry charges, desperate breaches, signal fires everywhere. Yet Rome's engineering and discipline crushed the Gallic hopes. Vercingetorix, once the symbol of defiance, had no choice but to surrender dramatically, throwing down his weapons at Caesar's feet in a scene worthy of Hollywood's slow motion. With Alesia's fall, Gaul was Rome's, and Caesar's legend was carved in stone. From this point on, he wasn't just a general, he was the unstoppable force of history itself. After years of clashing swords, endless marches, and enough fort building to make an architect blush, Caesar emerged from Gaul not just as a general, but as Rome's shining, unstoppable superstar. He had taken his men across mountains, rivers, seas, and even into the foggy unknown of Britannia. He had humbled fierce tribes, faced down rebellions, and turned setbacks into spectacles of brilliance. Alesia was the final stamp of victory, the mic drop moment that sealed his reputation. By now, his soldiers adored him, his enemies feared him, and even Rome itself was starting to whisper. Maybe Caesar wasn't just playing the game, he was rewriting the rulebook. The Senate, of course, grew nervous, because a man this successful tends to have ambitions that don't stop at foreign borders. But for now, in the glow of triumph, Caesar stood tall, red cloak billowing like a superhero's cape, basking in the glory of being the undefeated conqueror of Gaul. The chapter closed with a simple truth. He had transformed from a rising politician into a legend, and Rome would never be the same again. The first triumvirate had always been like a three-legged stool, awkward but stable enough to keep Roman politics wobbling along. But when Crassus, the man with pockets deeper than the Colosseum, decided to go play hero in Parthia, the stool lost its richest leg, and predictably, it collapsed with a loud thud. Crassus's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. Without him, Caesar and Pompey were suddenly staring at each other like two gladiators before the fight bell. The glue that kept them from tearing each other apart was gone, and Rome could already smell trouble brewing. Senators whispered in dark corners, merchants worried about who would collect taxes, and ordinary Romans just hoped bread prices wouldn't skyrocket. Caesar, busy basking in his Gallic glory, now had to prepare for the next chapter. Not just fighting barbarians, but clashing with his old ally turned rival. With Crassus out of the picture, the Roman stage was set for the ultimate showdown, an internal drama juicier than any amphitheater spectacle. With Crassus gone, Pompey suddenly found himself the most eligible political bachelor in Rome, and the Senate was quick to snatch him up. The old men in togas who had once grumbled about Pompey's ego now hailed him as their shining champion against Caesar. Pompey, who always liked being the center of attention, leaned right into the role. He strutted through the forum with senators whispering flattering words in his ear, while marble busts of him popped up faster than taverns selling cheap wine. To the Senate, Pompey was the perfect counterweight, a seasoned general, rich enough to fund campaigns and vain enough to believe he was saving the Republic. Caesar, still away in Gaul, must have rolled his eyes so hard you could hear it across the Alps. The alliance was dead, the friendship was cracked, and now Pompey had officially chosen his dance partner, the Senate, with its endless speeches and political scheming. It wasn't love, it was politics. And in Rome, that was the deadliest affair of all. The Senate, emboldened by Pompey's embrace, finally decided to play hardball with Caesar. They sent an official decree demanding that he disband his army and return to Rome as a humble citizen, preferably one without legions at his back. In theory, it was about protecting the Republic from tyranny. In practice, it was like asking a lion to kindly turn vegetarian. Caesar had spent years in Gaul, winning battles, writing bestsellers, and building an army that adored him. Expecting him to hand over his power was either political naivety or elite-level comedy. Senators strutted around, puffing out their chests, imagining Caesar meekly walking into the Senate House to face trials for overstepping his authority. Meanwhile, messengers galloped across the Alps with the decree, probably rehearsing their escape routes. Caesar read the order, raised an eyebrow, and likely muttered something along the lines of, "Sure, I'll disarm when amphorae start growing wings." The Republic was trying to clip Caesar's wings, but they were about to find out he had no intention of coming down from the skies he had already conquered. The decree from the Senate left Caesar with a choice as subtle as a gladiator's punch: surrender his army and face humiliation, or march forward and gamble everything. Standing by the Rubicon River, he didn't just face a stream of water, he stared at history's fork in the road. His soldiers waited in silence, knowing one step would mean civil war. Caesar, never one for half measures, allegedly muttered the legendary line, "The die is cast." In other words, he basically said, "Well, no going back now." With that, he rode across the Rubicon, his scarlet cloak billowing like a flag of defiance. It wasn't just a river crossing, it was a declaration that the Republic's old rules had expired. Behind him, his legionaries cheered, ready to follow their general into destiny. Ahead lay Pompey, the Senate, and a fractured Rome. By dipping his sandals into that stream, Caesar didn't just cross a river, he crossed into immortality. Once Caesar splashed across the Rubicon, the political tension in Rome burst like an overripe grape. Civil war wasn't declared with fanfare. It erupted like a street brawl that suddenly dragged in the whole neighborhood. On one side stood Caesar, champion of the populares with loyal legions marching under his scarlet banners. On the other stood Pompey, backed by the Senate's patrician pride and enough prestige to fill the Colosseum twice over. Families, once united by dinner feasts and gossip, now whispered in fear, whose side should they pick? Old friends glared across taverns like dueling gladiators. Merchants raised prices as if war itself was a profitable business. And Rome became a city where trust evaporated faster than cheap wine. Pompey rallied the senatorial elite, Caesar inspired the common soldiers, and both sides sharpened their swords not just for Rome's fate, but for their own survival. The Republic fractured into camps, and suddenly the city that once ruled the world couldn't even rule its own streets. When Caesar marched into Rome, it wasn't with the roar of endless battles. It was with the efficiency of a man walking into his own kitchen. The Senate had expected chaos, perhaps street fighting, but instead they found Caesar's legions moving like clockwork, seizing the city with military precision and an unnerving calm. Markets opened as usual, bakers kept baking, and the only thing that changed was that everyone whispered, "So, Caesar runs the place now?" Pompey and his allies, caught off guard, had slipped away faster than wine at a banquet, leaving Rome to Caesar without much resistance. To the people, it almost felt like a hostile takeover dressed as a parade, soldiers marching, banners flying, and Caesar riding in, cloak fluttering, like he was just claiming a long overdue promotion. Merchants quickly swapped Pompey's portrait for Caesar's on their shop walls. Senators who once booed his name now lined up to applaud. And Rome woke up one morning under new management. If Rome had Yelp, the reviews would say, "Peaceful transition of power, 5 stars, would recommend, unless you're Pompey." Pompey, once hailed as Rome's golden boy, found himself packing faster than a senator caught with unpaid taxes. With Caesar comfortably in control of the city, Pompey realized that Rome was no longer safe ground. So like any seasoned politician who sensed the winds turning, he booked the fastest one-way trip to Greece. His retreat wasn't exactly glorious. While Caesar was parading into Rome with cheers and banners, Pompey was quietly slipping out, his entourage dragging crates of gold, scrolls, and whatever dignity they could salvage. To his supporters, it was a strategic withdrawal. To everyone else, it looked suspiciously like running for dear life. Senators loyal to him scurried behind, forming a caravan that resembled less an army and more a panicked field trip. From across the sea, Pompey hoped to gather allies, raise forces, and reclaim his thunder. But the shadow of Caesar loomed large, and everyone knew this wasn't just a vacation. It was the prelude to a final, inevitable showdown. If Rome was the stage, Pompey had just exited, stage right, in a hurry. At Pharsalus, the long-brewing rivalry boiled over into a clash that would decide Rome's future. Pompey arrived with a massive army, twice the size of Caesar's, an intimidating show of numbers that looked more like a parade than a battlefield. Caesar, however, didn't flinch. He had fewer men, but each was a veteran who had followed him through Gaul and back. When the battle began, Pompey's men pushed forward like a human wave, confident that sheer size would do the job. Caesar's troops, instead of panicking, executed a clever maneuver, holding their charge until the very last second, then lunging forward with surgical precision. It was less like a war and more like watching professional boxers fight against overconfident amateurs. The turning point came when Caesar's cavalry, reinforced by hidden reserves, struck Pompey's flank, sending his army into chaos. Shields clattered, soldiers scattered, and what had begun as Pompey's grand display turned into a stampede for survival. Caesar stood victorious, not just by force but by brainpower, proving once again that strategy beats numbers. For Pompey, it was the day his legacy slipped through his fingers like sand. After his crushing defeat at Pharsalus, Pompey did what every fallen general dreams of. He ran away, hoping for a comeback tour. His destination? Egypt, the land of pyramids, papyrus, and political backstabbing. Pompey imagined a red carpet welcome, trumpets, cheering crowds, maybe even a camel parade. Instead, he got the ancient version of an unsubscribe button. Young Pharaoh Ptolemy V and his advisors feared Caesar more than they respected Pompey, so they decided to eliminate their guest before Caesar even asked. As Pompey stepped off the boat, still rehearsing his "I'll be back" speech, he was ambushed and stabbed, ending his career faster than you can say Senatus Populusque Romanus. His body was tossed aside, and his severed head preserved like some grotesque souvenir. When Caesar finally arrived, expecting a dramatic rematch, he was presented with Pompey's head on a platter. Literally. Caesar managed a show of grief, but inside, he probably sighed in relief and thought, well, that's one less calendar appointment. With Pompey gone and his severed head already doing the rounds in Alexandria, like a very grim party favor, Caesar emerged as the last man standing. Rome, once torn between rival banners, now had only one color dominating the skyline: Caesar's red cloak. The Senate, which had once shouted demands for him to disarm, now scrambled to polish speeches of loyalty faster than you can say, "Of Caesar." Citizens, tired of endless marches and uncertainty, cheered the man who brought stability, even if that stability came with a side order of dictatorship. Caesar himself must have felt like the star of the greatest comeback show in history, from rebel crossing the Rubicon to undisputed ruler of Rome, all within a few whirlwind years. Yet behind the triumphal smiles and feasts, the question lingered: was Rome saved by a hero or captured by a master strategist in a toga? For now, Caesar basked in absolute power, while history sharpened its quill to write both his glory and his doom. After storming through civil war and political chaos, Caesar suddenly found himself in Egypt, a land of pyramids, incense, and palace intrigue that made Roman politics look like children's games. But nothing prepared him for Cleopatra's grand entrance. Forget royal banquets or polite introductions. She didn't stroll into the room. She rolled in, literally hidden inside a rug, only to pop out like the most glamorous surprise package in history. Imagine Caesar's face. One moment he's expecting dusty scrolls, the next he's staring at a radiant queen with eyes sharper than a gladius. Cleopatra, with her wit, charm, and just the right amount of dramatic flair, knew exactly how to steal the spotlight. Caesar, the master of strategy, suddenly found himself on the defensive. Not on the battlefield, but in the heart. Their meeting wasn't just sparks flying, it was fireworks over the Nile. From this moment, politics and passion became hopelessly entangled, as Rome's most ambitious general met Egypt's most dazzling queen. Barely had the carpet trick been digested when Caesar found himself pulled into a full-blown Alexandrian brawl. The palace drama escalated into street warfare, with Cleopatra's supporters clashing against those backing her brother Ptolemy the Returned. Alexandria, usually known for philosophy and libraries, suddenly looked more like an action movie set, complete with fire, chaos, and confused locals, wondering if their city had signed up for a gladiator tournament. Caesar, never shy of chaos, dove right in. He turned the palace into a makeshift fortress, rallied his Roman soldiers, and fought with the stubbornness of a man who really, really hated losing. Ptolemy's forces tried everything, from naval skirmishes in the harbor to siege tactics at the palace gates. But Caesar's discipline and wit turned each ambush into slapstick comedy for the history books. One famous episode? The burning of part of the Great Library, as if the war needed bonus drama. Amid the smoke and arrows, Cleopatra stood as Caesar's dazzling ally, turning battlefield tension into an odd mixture of danger and flirtation. Rome's general and Egypt's queen were proving they weren't just partners in charm, they could fight a civil war in style. After the smoke of Alexandria cleared, Caesar switched from warrior to kingmaker. Cleopatra needed her crown polished back onto her head, and Caesar was more than happy to play stylist with a sword. He orchestrated a political makeover that would make even reality TV jealous. With Ptolemy III now floating somewhere in the Nile, not the vacation anyone asked for, Caesar staged a grand return for Cleopatra. Picture it, processions through Alexandria, Cleopatra riding like a goddess in gold, while Romans stood guard as if auditioning for imperial security, Egypt edition. To seal the deal, Caesar summoned nobles, priests, and officials, announcing with the flair of a showman that Cleopatra was now the rightful ruler of Egypt. The crowd half cheered, half gossiped, wondering why Rome suddenly had such a soft spot for eyeliner and pyramids. Caesar, meanwhile, wore the calm grin of a man who had turned chaos into a coronation. And Cleopatra sparkled with triumph, though everyone could see their alliance was less pure politics and more politics with serious chemistry. With Cleopatra back on the throne, politics suddenly took a romantic turn. And Rome's most eligible bachelor, Julius Caesar, found himself in a Nile-flavored soap opera. Between council meetings and military briefings, Caesar and Cleopatra were seen whispering in palace corridors, trading more than just political strategies. Cleopatra, dazzling in silks and scented oils, knew exactly how to turn a negotiation into a flirtation. Caesar, despite being twice her age, seemed utterly bewitched. Grinning like a schoolboy every time she spoke, the palace buzzed with gossip. Was this a political alliance or an episode of Love Under the Pyramids? Together they feasted, sailed the Nile on luxurious barges, and held lavish banquets that blended Roman grandeur with Egyptian extravagance. To outsiders, it looked like two rulers strengthening ties. To those closer, it was obvious that diplomacy had given way to desire. Caesar, who had marched legions across continents, now marched straight into Cleopatra's heart. And Cleopatra? She found in Caesar not just a protector of her throne, but a man who could turn her kingdom into a stage for history's most dramatic love affair. What started as whispers in palace corridors quickly echoed across the Mediterranean. The union of Caesar and Cleopatra was no longer just romance, it was politics with eyeliner. For Caesar, this alliance meant securing Egypt's wealth and grain supply, a lifeline for Rome's restless belly. For Cleopatra, it meant having Rome's top general as her personal bodyguard, political coach, and occasional dinner date. Senators back in Rome were not amused. Many grumbled that Caesar had traded the Senate's authority for Cleopatra's smile, while others feared he was dreaming of ruling not just Rome, but also the East, with Cleopatra as his queen. Meanwhile, merchants and diplomats saw opportunities bloom like lotus flowers. Trade routes bustled, cultural exchanges flourished, and suddenly half of Rome was trying to copy Egyptian fashion. But beneath the perfume and silks lurked real tension. Was Caesar using Cleopatra as a chess piece? Or had he himself become her pawn? Either way, their partnership was reshaping the map of power, one moonlit banquet at a time. Just when the world thought Caesar and Cleopatra's story was already dramatic enough, enter the surprise guest, a baby. His name? Caesarion, literally Little Caesar, though without the pizza chain. For Cleopatra, this was more than a royal nursery tale. It was the ultimate political statement. Having Caesar's child gave her a living symbol of alliance, legitimacy, and one heck of a conversation starter at state banquets. For Caesar, the news was both flattering and tricky. In Rome, whispers flew faster than arrows. Was this really his son, or just another clever move by Cleopatra? Senators fumed, rivals plotted, and Rome's gossip mill ran hotter than the desert sun. Still, the image of a child who bridged two empires was powerful. Some saw him as a future ruler uniting East and West, others as a pawn in Cleopatra's ambitious chess game. Either way, Caesarion's birth tightened the knot of love and politics, making the couple's story even harder to untangle. When Cleopatra sailed into Rome, it was less of a diplomatic visit and more of a red carpet premiere. Picture the streets buzzing like a gossip column brought to life. The locals expected a modest queen, maybe in a simple robe. Instead, Cleopatra arrived in full Egyptian glam, golden crown, silken gowns shimmering like the Nile at sunrise, and enough jewelry to blind half the forum. And she didn't come alone. By her side was little Caesarion, a baby-shaped political mic drop. Romans gawked, senators grumbled, and patrician wives clutched their pearls so hard they nearly snapped. For Caesar, introducing Cleopatra to Rome was like bringing home someone the family would never approve of. The neighbors talked, the politicians fumed, but he stood tall, proud as if daring the Senate to challenge him. Cleopatra, meanwhile, strolled through the eternal city as if it were just another annex of Alexandria, smiling knowingly at every shocked stare. Her presence didn't just make waves, it made a tidal wave, proving that love affairs could be just as scandalous as wars. For Caesar, balancing politics and romance was like juggling flaming torches while riding a chariot. On one hand, he had the Senate breathing down his neck, reminding him daily that Rome's dignity did not include Egyptian queens strutting around the forum. On the other, he had Cleopatra, brilliant, enchanting, and fully capable of turning any dinner into a royal spectacle with a single smile. At night, Caesar would whisper strategies of conquest by lamplight, while Cleopatra countered with tales of Nile floods and gods with falcon heads. Their conversations were half pillow talk, half political summit. Caesar walked a tightrope. Keep the senators from rioting, keep Cleopatra from feeling like a side quest, and somehow keep his reputation intact. To Rome, he was the all-powerful general. To Cleopatra, he was the man who once risked it all for her throne. And in truth, Caesar loved both titles. The balancing act was never easy. But if anyone could stride into the Senate chamber with a laurel crown by day and sneak into Cleopatra's villa with a grin by night, it was him. By the time Cleopatra was sipping wine in Rome, the Senate was chewing on sour grapes. Senators, already wary of Caesar's power, now had to stomach his glamorous guest from Egypt. The whispers in the Curia weren't just about taxes or grain anymore. They were about Caesar throwing banquets with Cleopatra and her entourage dressed in silk, while senators sat in itchy wool. To them, it looked like Caesar was swapping Roman discipline for Egyptian luxury. Some muttered that he wanted to crown himself king, others that Cleopatra had bewitched him with Nile magic. The more Caesar smiled at her in public, the sharper the frowns grew in the Senate. Behind closed doors, debates turned into shouting matches, scrolls slammed like tavern mugs, and the phrase, "Rome is not Alexandria," got tossed around like confetti. Caesar, as usual, brushed off the complaints with a grin, but the cracks were spreading. His love life wasn't just a matter of gossip anymore. It was fuel for political fire, and the senators were sharpening their daggers with every rumor. As the curtain falls on this chapter, Caesar's life looks less like a political biography and more like a soap opera written by the gods. On one hand, he is the conqueror of Gaul, the reformer of Rome, the man whose name makes enemies sweat. On the other, he is the lover of Cleopatra, a queen who can turn a Senate chamber into a gossip circle faster than a gladiator can swing a sword. Their story's not just romance, it's strategy, diplomacy, and power wrapped in silk sheets. Friends envied, enemies plotted, and Rome itself stood divided between admiration and outrage. Caesar's heart and Caesar's ambition were now locked in the same carriage, pulled in two directions, one toward glory in Rome, the other toward passion by the Nile. And as every Roman knew, when Caesar took both roads at once, the ride was bound to get bumpy. Love and politics didn't just cross paths in his life, they collided head-on, leaving sparks that would light the way to both greatness and tragedy. After the drama in Egypt, Caesar returned to Rome not as just another politician, but as the ultimate celebrity. Think red carpet, but with laurel wreaths instead of flash photography. The streets were packed, the crowds roared, and Rome threw him a welcome party that made even gladiatorial games look like a backyard barbecue. People hailed him as the savior of the Republic, the man who brought order out of chaos. Former rivals now shook his hand nervously, smiling as if their lives depended on it. Because let's be honest, they probably did. For Caesar, this wasn't just a homecoming. It was a victory lap that screamed, "I'm back, and bigger than ever." But beneath the applause and cheers, whispers were already spreading through the Senate. Was this triumphant general returning as a servant of Rome, or as its master? For now, the people didn't care. They were too busy throwing flowers, waving banners, and chanting his name as though he were the rock star of the ancient world. Fresh off his grand homecoming, Caesar didn't waste time collecting participation trophies. He went straight for the ultimate title, dictator. Normally, this position was supposed to be temporary, like a 6-month fix-it contract during emergencies. But Rome looked around and said, "Hey, let's just give it to him indefinitely." With the Senate's half-hearted approval and the people's cheers echoing in the streets, Caesar now had a job description that read, "Boss of everything." Senators nervously clapped as if they were at a comedy show where laughing was mandatory under penalty of exile. For Caesar, it was the perfect promotion. Unlimited power, no expiration date, and zero need to pretend he was taking orders from anyone else. To the citizens, he was the man who fed them, entertained them, and promised stability. To his opponents, he was starting to look suspiciously like a king in everything but the crown. But as far as Caesar was concerned, why settle for a crown when you could have Rome itself? With the shiny new title of dictator glued to his name, Caesar wasted no time drafting a to-do list longer than the Appian Way. First order of business: tame the chaos of Roman politics. He restructured the courts to run smoother, like swapping rusty chariots for freshly oiled ones. He cracked down on corruption with the enthusiasm of a man swatting flies at a picnic. Governors who used to treat provinces like their personal piggy banks suddenly had to file receipts. He also increased the size of the Senate, partly to make it more representative, but also, let's be honest, to stuff it with people who owed him favors. This political facelift didn't just polish Rome's machinery, it tightened Caesar's grip on every lever of power. For ordinary citizens, life seemed more stable. For the elite, it felt like the ground beneath their sandals was tilting. Caesar, however, strolled through these reforms with the casual swagger of a man rearranging furniture in a house he now fully owned. After retooling Rome's political gears, Caesar decided to tackle the social inequality clogging the streets like bad traffic on the Via Sacra. His solution? Land distribution. To the veterans who had followed him through mud, blood, and endless speeches, he granted plots of land. Finally, a reward that didn't involve more marching. To the poor citizens crammed in Rome's tenements, he offered farmland, a chance to swap noisy alleys for peaceful fields. It was part generosity, part genius. Fewer restless veterans meant fewer riots, and happier poor meant more cheers in the forum. Naturally, the rich landowners were less thrilled, watching their estates carved up like a pie at a family dinner, where Caesar had the biggest knife. Still, the reforms stuck, turning Caesar into a hero for the masses. He wasn't just a conqueror anymore. He was a landlord with a heart, or at least a sharp sense of politics wrapped in charity. Rome's calendar had become such a mess that people weren't sure if they were planting crops in spring or in what felt like autumn. Festivals arrived late, tax deadlines slipped conveniently, and politicians used the confusion like a magician's smoke bomb. Enter Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul and now aimed to conquer time itself. With advice from astronomers in Alexandria, he introduced the Julian calendar, a system based on the solar year, neat, reliable, and far less vulnerable to manipulation by sneaky senators. Suddenly, the year had 365 days, with a bonus leap day every 4 years, because even the sun deserved some Roman bureaucracy. Citizens cheered, farmers breathed easier, and accountants sighed with relief. Of course, not everyone was pleased. The old priestly class lost their calendar tinkering privileges, which had been their favorite political toy. Still, Caesar's reforms stuck, outliving him by millennia. Little did he know, centuries later, people would still be setting their New Year's resolutions on his schedule, and breaking them just as quickly. Caesar had conquered armies, tamed politics, and even reorganized time itself. So why not society? One of his boldest moves was expanding Roman citizenship. Before, being a Roman was like an exclusive VIP club, velvet rope, bouncers, and a guest list shorter than a senator's toga. Outsiders, even those who fought in Rome's wars or paid taxes, were left standing at the door. Caesar, however, thought bigger. He began granting citizenship to people across Italy and beyond. Soldiers who had bled for Rome, provincial elites who kept trade flowing, and even entire communities that played nice with the empire. The reaction? Ordinary folks cheered, while Rome's old aristocrats grumbled that their special status was being watered down like cheap wine. But for Caesar, it was simple math. More citizens meant more loyalty, more taxes, and more soldiers. In short, he wasn't just ruling Rome. He was building a Rome without borders, one toga size fits all. It was the kind of move that made him beloved by the masses, but left his enemies sharpening their daggers a little more eagerly. If Rome's Senate had been a rowdy tavern, Caesar just walked in, took the bartender's apron, and announced happy hour rules. The Senate, once the proud arena of pompous debates and endless speeches, suddenly found itself under Caesar's renovation project. He swelled its numbers from a cozy few hundred to nearly 1,000, stuffing it with loyalists, veterans, and provincial allies. Imagine the old guard, senators with noses higher than their sandals, now squeezed elbow to elbow with fresh-faced newcomers who still smelled like battlefield dust. Meetings became less about fiery debates and more about Caesar's directives being rubber-stamped with all the resistance of warm cheese. To critics, the Senate was turning into a choir where Caesar held the baton. To supporters, it was proof of inclusivity and modernization. Either way, Caesar had clipped the Senate's wings while handing them shiny badges to distract from the fact. Rome's political theater was still open, but the starring role belonged to one man only, Caesar, the playwright, director, and lead actor, all rolled into one. By now, Caesar was strolling through Rome like a man wearing an invisible crown. He didn't call himself a king. Oh no, that word was still toxic in Rome, where people hated monarchy almost as much as bad wine. But let's be honest, his actions screamed royalty louder than any title. Crowds parted when he appeared. Statues of him popped up like mushrooms after rain, and his face was stamped on coins so everyone could carry a mini Caesar in their pocket. He sat on a golden chair at public events, wore laurel wreaths like they were casual headbands, and accepted honors that made even Jupiter raise an eyebrow. The Senate still technically existed, but their role had shrunk to clapping like background extras in Caesar's personal play. To the people, he was a hero, a provider, almost a living god. To the nobles, however, this invisible crown was glowing a bit too bright. Caesar wasn't just playing king without a crown. He was rewriting the script of Roman politics, and everyone could feel the tension rising for the next act. But here's the catch. While the Roman people were cheering, the aristocrats were chewing their nails down to the bone. The Senate, once the grand stage of politics, was starting to feel more like Caesar's fan club. Some senators whispered that his invisible crown was turning way too visible. Others muttered over wine cups that today it's a laurel wreath, tomorrow it might be an actual crown, and then, bam, Rome has a king again. The word alone gave patricians cold sweats. These were men who would rather wrestle lions than see the republic turned into a monarchy. The tension grew in hushed gatherings, private dinners filled with forced smiles, backroom meetings with more dagger stares than toasts, and endless debates about what to do with a dictator who refused to step off stage. To the nobles, Caesar was no longer just a brilliant general or a reformer. He was a thundercloud looming over the republic. Each joke he cracked, each honor he accepted, felt like another nail hammered into the coffin of senatorial pride. And when pride is wounded, daggers are never too far away. And so, Caesar stood at the very peak of his power, the master of Rome in everything but name. The streets cheered his victories, the people clapped for his reforms, and the Senate, well, they clapped too, but mostly through gritted teeth. From the outside, it looked like a perfect empire. Bread for the poor, land for the veterans, a brand new calendar that actually made sense. Yet behind the applause, shadows grew long. The nobles' whispers buzzed like angry bees, plotting behind marble walls. Caesar himself seemed untouchable, striding through the forum like a man born to rule, his laurel wreath shining like a crown that dared not speak its name. But in Rome, power was always a double-edged sword. The higher he climbed, the sharper the daggers glinted below. His destiny was hanging in the air, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. For now he basked in the glory, smiling at the city that adored him, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that even the brightest spotlight cast the darkest shadows. The Senate was supposed to be a place of noble debate, but lately it resembled a gossip market with better columns. Senators whispered behind marble pillars, their togas fluttering like nervous pigeons. The problem? Caesar had become too powerful, too dazzling, too everything. His reforms had won him the love of the people, but to the elite, it felt like watching their worst nightmare walk around in sandals. Some grumbled that he was acting like a king. Others hissed that Rome was becoming his personal playground. And when senators agree on something, it's usually bad news for whoever they're talking about. Over dinners and secret gatherings, Their complaints piled up like amphorae in a warehouse. Caesar this, Caesar that, Caesar everywhere. The more he shined in public, the darker their resentment grew. Behind the polite applause and forced smiles, a storm was brewing in the Senate. The air thickened with suspicion, and each whisper seemed to sharpen invisible knives. Rome adored Caesar, but in the shadows, envy and fear were already drafting his obituary. As the Senate's whispers thickened like smoke, a new rumor began to coil its way through Rome. Caesar wanted to be king. The word rex was like garlic to Romans, instant repulsion. After all, they had kicked out kings centuries ago, and now here came Caesar, parading with honors, statues, and even a fancy golden chair at public events. People muttered, if it walks like a king, sits like a king, and gets worshipped like a king, maybe it is a king. The rumors spread faster than wine at a feast. Street performers mocked him in plays, senators frowned harder than usual, and even the common folk began to wonder if their beloved leader secretly wanted a crown. Of course, Caesar laughed it off, saying he had no interest in such nonsense. But then why let people call entire months after him, or accept a diadem offered in public, even if he refused it with a smirk? Every denial seemed to add fuel to the fire. To Rome's elite, it wasn't a question of if Caesar wanted to be king, but when he'd make his move. And nothing scared senators more than sandals stepping on their political turf. By now, the Senate was buzzing like a nest of angry hornets, and two men decided to grab the fly swatter, Brutus and Cassius. Cassius, sharp-tongued and perpetually annoyed, fumed that Caesar was swallowing Rome whole. Brutus, on the other hand, looked like the friend who reluctantly joins a group project, but ends up writing the conclusion. The irony? Caesar trusted Brutus like family, but Rome's political stage had no room for sentiment, only drama. Late-night meetings took place in shadowy corners, whispers sounding more like hissing snakes. One senator muttered about Caesar's royal ambitions, another slammed his fist and shouted about saving the Republic. Soon a whole crew of conspirators gathered, forming what could only be described as the least cheerful club in history. They weren't planning a toga party, they were planning a knife party. The logic was simple, if a bit bloody. Better one Caesar dead than Rome wearing a crown. And so while Caesar polished his image in public, behind closed doors Brutus and Cassius were sharpening more than their arguments. The fateful morning arrived and Caesar strolled toward the Senate like a man heading to a casual meeting, not a historic crime scene. His entourage trailed behind, some whispering warnings, others just adjusting their togas. A soothsayer had already told him to beware the Ides of March, but Caesar brushed it off with the confidence of someone who thinks fortune cookies are just snacks. As he approached the Senate steps, senators lined up like actors waiting for their cue, faces plastered with fake smiles that could rival a bad stage play. Inside, the marble halls felt colder than usual, every shadow stretching like it had a secret. Caesar, dressed in his flowing crimson-trimmed toga, looked every inch the untouchable ruler. He raised a hand to greet the assembly, his expression smug and relaxed, as though expecting applause. Instead, what awaited him was a stage set for betrayal. The conspirators tightened their circle, each pretending to welcome him while hiding blades of ambition. Rome's most powerful man had just walked into the most dangerous room in the Republic, completely unaware that history was about to take a very bloody turn. The moment snapped like a thunderclap in a clear sky. As Caesar stepped further into the chamber, the senators swarmed with sudden precision. At first, one approached with what looked like a humble petition, but instead of handing parchment, he pulled a blade from his toga. The strike came fast, tearing Caesar's calm like paper. Shock spread across his face, not because of the pain, but because someone actually dared to stab the guy who just rebuilt Rome like a home makeover project. Then came another thrust and another, daggers flashing like an angry chorus line. Caesar staggered, blood staining the marble floor, while the Senate transformed from a political hall into a butcher shop. Some senators lunged with hesitation, stabbing as if ticking off a grim attendance sheet. Others went at him with the fury of men who'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror. Through it all, Caesar tried to hold himself upright, his dignity battling gravity, refusing to collapse too quickly. The chamber echoed with chaos. steel clashing against flesh, robes rustling, and history being rewritten in crimson strokes. It was the moment the Republic's fear took physical form, and Caesar, the once untouchable, finally felt it sink deep. Amid the frenzy of blades, time seemed to slow. Caesar, gasping and staggering, suddenly locked eyes with a familiar face among the attackers. Brutus, the young man he had treated like a son. The shock in Caesar's gaze was heavier than any dagger piercing his body. Bloodied and reeling, he raised his voice, not in rage, but in a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Out came the phrase destined to echo through history. Et tu, Brute! It wasn't just words. It was the ultimate mic drop of betrayal. The kind that could make even soap opera writers jealous. The Senate chamber fell eerily silent for a heartbeat, as if even the assassins realized the moment had gone from stabbing to Shakespearean. Brutus, torn but resolute, met Caesar's eyes with grim determination, sealing the tragedy. With that, Caesar's resistance drained away. He lowered his arms, accepting his fate, as though the Republic had already signed his death certificate. The phrase traveled far beyond those marble walls, immortalizing not just a murder, but the sting of betrayal so personal that history would forever replay it like the most quoted line in political drama. When Caesar finally collapsed, Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. The mighty general who had crossed the Rubicon, conquered Gaul, and rewritten the rulebook of politics now lay lifeless on the Senate floor. Like the ultimate plot twist nobody could rewind. Outside, word of his death spread faster than gossip at a gladiator's afterparty. Citizens gasped, shopkeepers dropped their wares, and soldiers exchanged looks as if someone had just unplugged the power source of the Republic. Some cheered, convinced they had dodged a king's crown. Others wept, fearing Rome had just murdered its future. Senators tried to maintain their "we saved democracy" faces, but panic buzzed through the marble halls like angry bees. The city was now a cauldron, part shock, part rage, part what happens next? The death of Caesar wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the tremor that cracked Rome's foundation. And as the echoes of "Et tu, Brute" still lingered, the people of Rome realized history wasn't ending. It was only about to get messier. The funeral of Caesar was meant to be a solemn affair, but Rome being Rome, it quickly escalated into something closer to a blockbuster riot. The pyre was built high in the Forum, draped with garlands and banners, while Antony delivered a speech that could win every Oscar for most dramatic performance. His words painted Caesar not as a tyrant, but as Rome's ultimate BFF, the man who had given lands, victories, and even dreams of glory. By the time Antony whipped out Caesar's blood-stained toga, the crowd was practically foaming at the mouth. Citizens who had come to mourn turned into an angry mob, hurling curses at the assassins. Vendors dropped figs and olives to grab torches. Black smoke rose like Rome itself was crying. The solemn funeral morphed into a revolution starter pack. Senators who thought they'd saved the Republic suddenly realized they might need a new exit plan, preferably one involving running shoes. Caesar's death wasn't just being remembered. It was becoming the spark that set Rome ablaze. From the moment Caesar fell, his image refused to die with him. In fact, Rome did what Rome does best. It turned him into a brand. Statues popped up faster than modern billboards. Coins bore his face like ancient selfies. And poets couldn't stop name-dropping him as if he were the hottest celebrity in town. The senators who stabbed him had hoped to erase a would-be king, but instead they created a legend with better marketing than any toga shop. In the Forum, murals and busts of Caesar suddenly multiplied, making him look less like a murdered politician and more like Rome's eternal mascot. Citizens whispered his name as if invoking a protective charm, while ambitious leaders rushed to borrow his aura for their own careers. Even Antony and Octavian weren't mourning so much as strategizing how to claim a piece of the Caesar brand. Ironically, the man they feared would rule forever did just that, through memory, marble, and myth. Caesar was no longer just a man. He had leveled up into a symbol Rome couldn't, and didn't want to, forget. And so the curtain falls on Caesar's mortal life, but the stage lights stay on for his legacy. His enemies thought they had written the final line with their daggers, Yet all they did was hand him an encore that would echo through the centuries. Rome, ever dramatic, transformed his death into the spark of a new era. Out of the bloodied Senate floor rose not silence, but voices of ambition. Antony plotting with speeches sharper than swords. Octavian quietly preparing his long game, like a master chess player, and the Roman people roaring like a restless audience who had not gotten their money's worth. Caesar's story ends here, but his shadow only grows larger, stretching over politics, war, and culture for generations to come. One man's downfall became the empire's turning point, proof that in Rome, endings were never really endings, just cliffhangers for the next season of history. Rome after Caesar's death looked less like a republic and more like a tavern brawl where everyone had too much wine and forgot the rules. Senators scrambled like chickens without a coop, unsure whether to celebrate freedom or run for their lives. The assassins, Brutus and Cassius, tried to present themselves as noble liberators, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Rome preferred drama, not excuses. Meanwhile, Caesar's allies, led by Antony, were sharpening their speeches and their swords, ready to cash in on public outrage. The streets echoed with chants, protests, and the sound of sandals stomping in panic. Shops closed, rumors spread faster than gladiator gossip, and statues of Caesar were suddenly covered in flowers like makeshift shrines. It wasn't the calm after the storm, it was the storm after the storm. Everyone sensed that Caesar's death hadn't solved anything. It had only tossed a torch into a haystack, and Rome was about to go up in political flames. Into the chaos stepped Mark Antony, a man who could turn a funeral into a rock concert. As Caesar's loyal friend, he stood before the crowd with a scroll in one hand and grief plastered on his face, though everyone knew he was also calculating, like a seasoned poker player. Antony began softly, painting Caesar as a generous leader, then slowly raised the tempo until the crowd's tears turned into fury. When he unveiled Caesar's bloodied toga, gasps echoed louder than thunder. And when he read Caesar's will, revealing that every Roman citizen had been left a gift, the city practically exploded. People who had been quietly watching were now ready to riot, screaming for vengeance against the assassins. Antony wasn't just giving a eulogy, he was stirring a pot of rage and serving it as steaming hot. By the time he finished, Rome had gone from mourning to a full-on manhunt. Brutus and Cassius might have thought they killed a man, but Antony's words made sure Caesar lived on, stronger than ever. Just when Rome thought Antony had stolen the spotlight, another name popped up on the credits. Gaius Octavius, better known as Octavian. Barely out of his teenage years, Octavian looked more like a student late for Latin class than a political heavyweight. But fate, and Caesar's will, had other plans. Turns out, Caesar had adopted him as his heir, which instantly upgraded him from that kid with potential to the kid with Rome in his pocket. The senators scoffed, Antony smirked, and the assassins shrugged. Surely this skinny boy couldn't shake the Republic. Yet Octavian had the sharp mind of a chess player and the patience of a cat watching a mouse hole. He didn't roar like Antony. He whispered, maneuvered, and slowly gathered allies. Rome might have expected another general in armor, but instead they got a quiet storm in a toga. And in the power vacuum left by Caesar, this unassuming heir would prove to be one of the deadliest pieces on the board. After Antony's fiery speech and Octavian's sudden appearance as Caesar's heir, Brutus and Cassius realized Rome was about to turn into a boiling pot. And guess what? They were the beans everyone wanted to cook first. The senators no longer cheered them as liberators, but eyed them like unwanted dinner guests who had overstayed their welcome. So Brutus and Cassius made the very Roman choice: pack up and run, but not without style. They didn't sneak out like thieves. Instead, they marched away with an entourage, declaring loudly that they were saving the Republic from a safe distance. Their departure was half political retreat, half awkward vacation. While Antony tightened his grip and Octavian quietly collected power, Brutus and Cassius drifted eastward, hoping to gather troops and supporters. Yet leaving Rome meant surrendering the stage to their rivals. And soon their heroic act looked less like saving freedom and more like ghosting the city. History would remember their exit as the moment the so-called defenders of liberty swapped the capital for the countryside, leaving Antony and Octavian to set the rules of the next act. As Brutus and Cassius disappeared eastward, Rome didn't sit idle. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus huddled together like three men trying to share one throne-sized chair. Each had different skills. Antony, the battle-hardened general with a booming voice. Octavian, the calculating youth with the mind of a chess master. And Lepidus. Well, someone had to bring the snacks. Together they formed what history now calls the Second Triumvirate. But in practice, it looked suspiciously like a temporary truce at a family reunion. They smiled for the political portrait, yet each was already calculating how to outmaneuver the others. To the public, this alliance promised stability, justice, and revenge for Caesar. Behind closed doors, it was more like, let's team up until I figure out how to stab you in the back without anyone noticing. The city cheered as the three clasped hands. But Rome's fate was sealed in a handshake that had all the warmth of an icy dagger. The triumvirate wasn't a marriage of trust. It was a power deal wrapped in polite smiles, destined to explode as soon as Caesar's killers were handled. With the second triumvirate freshly minted, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus wasted no time sharpening their political knives. Their first mission? Hunting down Caesar's assassins. They drew up prescriptions, lists of enemies to be eliminated, that made half of Rome suddenly wish they had taken an extended vacation to Egypt. Wealthy senators and old rivals scrambled to hide, while bounty hunters practically set up shop. For Antony, it was personal vengeance. For Octavian, it was about securing his inheritance. And for Lepidus, well, he mostly tried not to get left behind. Streets filled with whispers of betrayal as neighbors turned each other in for rewards. Families cried, fortunes vanished overnight. And Rome became a city where crossing the wrong name could be your last mistake. To the triumvirs, this wasn't cruelty. It was justice with benefits. After all, seizing the estates of the condemned conveniently funded their armies. With each execution and each confiscated villa, their grip on Rome tightened. The republic that Brutus and Cassius claimed to defend looked less like a noble ideal and more like a soon-to-be vacant house waiting for new tenants. The showdown came at Philippi, where ideals clashed with sheer numbers. On one side, Brutus and Cassius, champions of the Republic, stood with their legions, hoping to prove that stabbing Caesar wasn't just bad manners, but also noble resistance. On the other side, Antony and Octavian marched in like a mismatched band duo, but with far more soldiers and a lot more anger. The battle unfolded like a chaotic street fight on steroids. Dust clouds rose, trumpets blared, and soldiers clashed in a frenzy. Cassius, overwhelmed and misinformed, thought his side had lost and chose the classic Roman exit strategy, falling on his own sword. Brutus, left with dwindling hope, soon followed. Antony, ever the showman, basked in victory, while Octavian quietly checked another box off his long-term plan for power. Philippi wasn't just another battle, it was the grand finale for the so-called liberators. Their dream of saving the Republic collapsed under the boots of triumviral legions, leaving Rome one step closer to crowning emperors instead of electing consuls. Victory at Philippi should have united Antony and Octavian, but instead it turned their alliance into an awkward roommate situation. Antony, older and more flamboyant, strutted around like a rock star who thought he owned the empire, while Octavian, younger and colder, kept track of every slight with the precision of a tax collector. Their shared throne was beginning to look like a two-seat chariot headed in opposite directions. And Antony's grand affair with Cleopatra only poured oil on the fire. Romans whispered that he was more interested in Egyptian banquets than Roman politics. Octavian, ever the PR genius, played the role of the dutiful Roman son, carefully painting Antony as a love-struck traitor. Behind the scenes, each sharpened plans as carefully as daggers. Antony dreaming of ruling east with Cleopatra, Octavian plotting his rise as the sole ruler of Rome. Their partnership, once forged in Caesar's blood, now cracked under ambition and jealousy. What had begun as cooperation was rapidly transforming into a gladiator match for the soul of Rome. The alliance between Antony and Octavian had officially entered the "It's not you, it's me" stage of breakup. Rome, meanwhile, braced itself for yet another round of civil war, as if the Republic had signed up for a never-ending drama series. Antony, swept up in Cleopatra's glittering world of banquets and gold, dreamed of ruling the East like a pharaoh in Roman armor. Octavian, ever the strategist, painted himself as the protector of Rome's traditions, whispering in the Senate's ear that Antony had traded his sword for eyeliner. The streets buzzed with rumors. Armies shifted allegiance like fans at a gladiator match, and the once shared throne fractured into two rival courts. Soldiers polished their helmets, knowing another bloody chapter was about to be written. The people of Rome, tired but resigned, stocked up on bread and gossip. After all, nothing was more Roman than watching powerful men tear the Republic apart in the name of saving it. The Civil War wasn't just a conflict, it was the birth pangs of something new, the Roman Empire. The curtain falls on Caesar's death, but instead of peace, Rome finds itself binge-watching a never-ending sequel of chaos. What was supposed to be the final act turned into season 2 of Who Wants to Rule Rome, with even higher stakes. Antony and Octavian glare across the chessboard of the Republic, each convinced destiny reserved the winner's seat for them. Lepidus, the forgotten third wheel, drifts quietly into history's background like the guy no one remembers in a band. Meanwhile, the Senate, once a pillar of order, now looks more like a comedy troupe trying to improvise their way through disaster. The citizens, weary but entertained, gather in forums whispering, "Caesar's gone, but the bloodbath has a subscription plan." Rome had lost its greatest leader, yet the wars he left behind burned hotter than ever. Out of this fire, a new order would rise, not the return of the Republic, but the dawn of the Empire. Caesar's death didn't end the story. It kicked off the grand finale Rome never knew it had signed up for. Before Caesar became a political thunderstorm, he was already a military genius who turned maps into personal doodle pads. With one hand holding a sword and the other a strategy board, he marched across Gaul like it was his backyard, defeating tribes faster than gossip spreads in the Roman Forum. His secret? Engineering brains and iron guts. Where others saw obstacles, Caesar saw construction projects, bridges built in days, sieges wrapped tighter than a toga, and cavalry charges that felt like opening night of a gladiator show. His army adored him, not just because he shared their rations, but because he made them feel like history's headliners. While his enemies thought they were facing one man, they were actually facing a human chess master who played both sides of the board at once. By the time Rome caught on, Caesar had already checked half of Europe. He wasn't just fighting wars, he was auditioning for immortality. And spoiler alert, he nailed the role. If Caesar was a maestro of the battlefield, he was also a backstage director of Roman politics. Forget subtle tweaks. He rolled in like an ancient handyman with a toolbox labeled "Reforms for Dummies." Debts crushing the poor? Slash them. Calendar chaos? Fix it. Senators clogging the forum? Expand the Senate. Though some grumbled, it felt like adding random cousins to the family dinner. He tackled corruption, cut through bureaucracy, and handed out Roman citizenship like it was a loyalty card. To his supporters, these reforms made Rome stronger, fairer, and more modern. To his enemies, it felt like Caesar was rewriting the rulebook so only he got the high score. And honestly, both sides were a little bit right. His reforms planted seeds for an empire that would outlive him by centuries, while also making him look suspiciously like a one-man government. The paradox of Caesar, part visionary, part power grabber, but 100% unforgettable in the political arena. Among Caesar's many legacies, one of the sneakiest but most enduring is something you glance at every single day: the calendar. Before Caesar, Romans were juggling a calendar so messy that festivals were turning up like surprise parties, and harvests sometimes got scheduled in midwinter. Caesar, ever the problem solver, called in astronomers, waved his consul's pen like a magic wand, and created the Julian calendar in 46 BCE. Suddenly, the year had 365 days with a leap day every 4 years. Simple, elegant, and far less chaotic. It was the kind of reform that didn't just fix Rome's timing issues, It rewired how humanity would measure time for centuries. Sure, the Catholic Church would later fine-tune it into the Gregorian calendar, but Caesar's version was the blueprint. Imagine leaving behind not just conquests and statues, but the way people check their birthday reminders 2,000 years later. Caesar's calendar wasn't just about organizing time, it was about conquering it. If Caesar conquered Gaul with swords, he conquered eternity with ink. His own writings, like the famous Commentaries on the Gallic War, weren't just reports. They were PR campaigns disguised as literature. He painted himself as the brave strategist, always brilliant, occasionally modest, and somehow never at fault. Poets and playwrights later picked up the brush, turning him into everything from a tragic hero to a cautionary tale. Shakespeare, centuries later, gave us the most dramatic version, a Caesar strutting in confidence, only to be brought down by friends with sharper knives than loyalty. Artists sculpted him into marble perfection, while painters filled galleries with his busts and battles. In literature and art, Caesar became a character bigger than Caesar the man, sometimes wise, sometimes arrogant, but always unforgettable. Even when vilified, his image carried charisma. That's the funny thing about art. It doesn't just immortalize, it mythologizes. And in Caesar's case, it made sure he would never exit stage left, because history and art kept giving him encore after encore. Julius Caesar's legacy comes with a question mark big enough to cover the Roman Forum. Was he a hero who saved Rome, or a tyrant who broke the Republic? Supporters praise him as the visionary who fed the poor, reformed the calendar, and expanded Rome's power with brains and bravado. Detractors, however, see him as the man who turned senatorial debate into my way or the highway, marching toward dictatorship with a smug grin. To some, he was the brilliant strategist who brought stability to chaos. To others, he was the power-hungry strongman who crushed liberty under his sandals. The funny part is, both sides were right in their own way. His name lives on as a synonym for both genius and ambition run wild. So was Caesar a savior or usurper? Perhaps the real answer is yes. History rarely deals in neat categories, and Caesar, with all his contradictions, proves that the line between hero and tyrant is thinner than a senator's dagger. Centuries after his death, Julius Caesar has become less of a man and more of a cultural brand. He's been turned into Shakespeare's tragic star, Hollywood's toga-wearing icon, and even the inspiration behind a salad that has nothing to do with him. Sorry, foodies. From epic films with booming orchestras to memes that caption him saying, "Et tu, bro?" Caesar keeps showing up in places he never planned. His face, stern and proud, has graced everything from coins to comic strips. And let's not forget the countless actors, each competing to deliver the most dramatic "et tu" brute, as if auditioning for Rome's Got Talent. The irony is delicious. The man who once fought to control the Senate now has no control over how he's portrayed. Whether you picture him as a heroic general, a ruthless dictator, or a meme template with a sarcastic caption, Caesar has conquered popular culture just as thoroughly as he conquered Gaul. Except this time, his battlefield is Netflix, theater stages, and the internet. Julius Caesar's shadow didn't vanish with his last breath. It marched right into the playbooks of future leaders. Napoleon read Caesar's commentaries like they were a military cheat code, and Alexander Hamilton couldn't stop quoting him in political debates, even if his opponents rolled their eyes. Even modern statesmen, from Churchill to contemporary generals, studied his mix of charisma and strategy as if he had left behind a leadership manual titled Dictatorship for Dummies. His balance of charm, iron will, and PR genius became the golden recipe for those who dream big, sometimes too big. But Caesar's afterlife in leadership wasn't only about admiration, he was also a warning sign. Tyrants invoked his name as a role model, while Democrats invoked it as a cautionary tale. Either way, he sat in the back seat of history's car, whispering directions to rulers who often pretended they were driving. It's proof that even 2,000 years later, the man who crossed the Rubicon is still crossing into the minds of anyone trying to lead, conquer, or simply make history remember their name. If ambition had a poster boy, Julius Caesar would be smirking on it. His life was practically a masterclass in wanting more. More land, more titles, more power, and let's not forget, more statues of himself scattered across Rome. From his daring military campaigns to his not-so-subtle grab at political dominance, Caesar embodied the dream and nightmare of ultimate ambition. He didn't just cross the Rubicon, he practically turned it into a runway, strutting into Rome as if to say, "Yes, I'll take the dictatorship, thank you very much." Since then, countless leaders, both brilliant and disastrous, have tried to replicate his formula: charisma, audacity, and just enough ruthlessness to get the job done. He became the archetype of the power-hungry leader, a model that inspires admiration in some and caution in others. After all, Caesar's story is both a pep talk for dreamers who want to rise above their station and a warning label that says, "Careful, absolute ambition may cause stabbing incidents in the Senate." Power is a seductive drink, sweet at first sip, but dangerously intoxicating if you keep chugging. Julius Caesar learned this lesson the hard way. His rise to absolute authority was dazzling, but it also turned him into the ultimate cautionary tale. When one man holds too much power, everyone else starts sharpening their daggers. His story is less about whether he was a genius or a tyrant, and more about the universal truth that unchecked power comes with a hefty price tag. In Rome's case, that price was political chaos, civil war, and one very messy Senate floor. Caesar's ambition showed that a single man could bend an empire to his will, but it also proved that even the greatest are vulnerable when they forget to share the toys of power. History whispers this lesson over and over. Absolute authority might look glamorous, but sooner or later, someone will ask for the bill, and it usually arrives in the form of daggers at dawn. As our tale of Julius Caesar draws to a close, the man himself feels less like a historical figure and more like a recurring character who simply refuses to leave the stage. His name echoes through centuries, painted in marble, stamped on coins, dropped casually into political speeches, and even memeified for the internet age. Few mortals manage to cross the finish line of time with such flair, but Caesar does it with sandals firmly strapped. His legacy is not just in Rome's ruins or dusty scrolls, but in every debate about leadership, ambition, and the thin line between vision and vanity. We began with the boy chasing power, and we end with the legend who outpaced mortality. Whether adored or despised, Julius Caesar became more than a man. He became a benchmark, a story endlessly retold, a wink from history itself. And so, as the curtain falls, we leave with this thought: Caesar may be gone, but his shadow walks beside us still.